In the weeks after the court ruling, Cedar Ridge felt different. The silence that used to hum beneath its manicured lawns was gone, replaced by murmurs, conversations, and the cautious sound of people rediscovering their voices. For years, residents had walked the same sidewalks in quiet compliance. They had accepted the endless letters, the arbitrary rules, the constant scrutiny as just part of living in a respectable community. But once they saw the truth, once they saw what had been done to Ellen, something inside them changed. It began quietly, a single sign taped to a mailbox, HOA board recall vote, Friday at 6, then another, and another. By the end of the week, nearly every house had one. Ellen didn't attend the meeting. She told herself she didn't need to. Her part was done. The bench, the lawsuit, the fight. It was enough. But that evening, as she sat on her porch, she could hear the distant sound of raised voices from the community clubhouse. Doors opening, cars idling, people who had never spoken to each other gathering under the same roof to confront what they had allowed for too long. Later, her neighbor, a soft-spoken man named George, who lived 2 houses down, walked over. He held a folded paper in his hand. "It's over," he said simply. "She's out. The entire board resigned." Ellen nodded, her throat tightening. She thanked him, but there wasn't joy in her voice, just relief. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt something close to peace, fragile but real. In the days that followed, neighbors began stopping by more often. Some brought fresh-cut flowers. Others came just to talk. One woman admitted she'd been fined for hanging wind chimes without permission. Another confessed the HOA had forced her to remove a playset her grandchildren loved. Every story carried the same weight, small humiliations that had been quietly endured until Ellen's case gave people permission to see them for what they were, control, not community. Ellen never intended to become a symbol, but that's exactly what she became. The local paper ran a follow-up story titled, "One Woman's Fight Restores Balance to Cedar Ridge." Soon after, a statewide HOA reform group reached out, asking if she'd share her story at a public hearing on homeowners' rights. She said no at first. She wasn't a public speaker, and she didn't want the attention. But a week later, she changed her mind. Standing at that podium months later, the courthouse walls replaced by the echo of a civic hearing room, Ellen found her voice again. She told her story plainly, without theatrics. She spoke about grief, about control, about how easy it was for a place meant to be home to become something that felt like a cage. Her words struck a chord. Legislators took notes. Reporters quoted her testimony. And quietly, policy discussions began about limiting HOA authority over personal property. Her late husband had always told her, "Peace isn't quiet, Elle, it's balance." And for the first time she understood what he meant. Back in Cedar Ridge, a new board formed, smaller, humbler, more transparent. They invited residents to review every bylaw, every clause that had once been used as a weapon. Fines were frozen. Complaints were handled face-to-face, not through anonymous letters. The neighborhood that once prided itself on perfection began to look imperfect again, and in that imperfection it felt more human. Lawns grew a little wilder, colors varied, people laughed louder. The bench, the new one painted a warm honey brown by her neighbors, remained where the first one had stood. Sometimes Ellen sat there with a cup of coffee, watching the sunset. Sometimes someone else would sit there instead. A teenager scrolling through their phone, an older couple taking a walk. No one called it an unapproved structure anymore. It had become something else, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been found again. But not everyone forgot. Patricia Monroe sold her house 3 months after resigning. The rumor was that she couldn't stand the whispers, the looks, the way the community she once ruled now treated her like an outcast. Some said she moved to a gated community 2 towns over, one with stricter rules, tighter lawns, and an HOA just as powerful as she once dreamed hers to be. Ellen never saw her again. But sometimes, on quiet mornings, she thought about her, about how someone could become so obsessed with control that they lost all sense of compassion. It would have been easy to hate her, but Ellen didn't. She pitied her, because Patricia's world had always been small, confined by fences and bylaws and fear of imperfection. Ellen's, after everything, had finally opened up. The story didn't just stay local. Months later, Ellen received a letter, this time not from an HOA, but from a woman in another state. The handwriting was careful, the paper lined and slightly wrinkled. "I saw your story online," it read. "My HOA tore down the tree my husband planted before he passed. They said it was unapproved landscaping. I didn't know anyone else understood what that felt like. Thank you for standing up." Ellen read it twice. Then she folded it neatly and placed it in the same drawer where she had once kept that cruel, anonymous note. But this one she kept on top. Spring came early that year. The roses bloomed before anyone expected them to. Ellen tended to them slowly, her hands steady. The garden was still small, still quiet, but it no longer felt fragile. It felt alive. One afternoon, as she was trimming the new buds, a young couple from down the street stopped by. They were new to the neighborhood, first-time homeowners, bright-eyed and nervous. They asked her if the stories were true, about the bench, the court case, the HOA. Ellen smiled softly. "Most of it," she said. The woman hesitated before asking, "Was it worth it?" Ellen looked at her garden, at the sunlight spilling across the roses. "Every letter, every meeting, every minute I thought I couldn't take another fight. It was worth it," she said, "because now no one here has to go through it alone." That night she sat on the bench again, the air heavy with the smell of cut grass and rain. The lights of Cedar Ridge glowed gently in the distance. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like an outsider looking in. She thought about all the people who had sent her messages, who had shared their stories, who had found courage in hers. Maybe that was the real legacy, not the bench, not the court victory, but the ripple it started. Grief had led her here. Injustice had pushed her. But community, real community, had caught her before she fell. Weeks later, during a community cleanup day, Ellen noticed something she hadn't before. Near the clubhouse where Patricia used to stand during inspections, someone had placed a small plaque in the flower bed. It read, "For peace, fairness, and the courage to stand." No one admitted to putting it there, but everyone left it. Ellen smiled when she saw it, not because it honored her, but because it meant the neighborhood had changed. It had learned something that rules could never teach. When the local news revisited the story a year later, the reporter asked her, "A final question. What would you tell someone going through something like you did?" Ellen paused, her eyes tracing the garden behind her. "I'd tell them this," she said softly. "When people try to take away what matters to you, your peace, your memories, your home, stand your ground. They can fine you, threaten you, even break what you've built. But they can't take your voice unless you give it to them." She smiled then, just faintly. And sometimes that voice can change more than just your street. That segment aired across the state. The comment section filled with hundreds of messages, from homeowners, renters, even HOA board members, all debating, empathizing, reflecting. But buried in the middle of them, one comment stood out. "Maybe the real problem isn't HOAs. Maybe it's forgetting that neighborhoods are supposed to be made of people, not rules." And that, Ellen thought when she read it, said everything she never could. Because in the end, the story of Cedar Ridge wasn't just about a bench or an HOA or a courtroom victory. It was about the moment a quiet woman refused to stay quiet any longer and reminded an entire town what compassion really looks like. So what do you think? Was Ellen right to fight back, or should she have just let it go? Because sometimes peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the courage to face it head on.